Good afternoon and welcome to Across the Fence. I'm Joleil Whitney. This coming April will mark the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon and the dramatic end of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. One of the photos seared into the history of the 20th century is this photo taken by UPI photographer Hubert Van Ness of evacuees attempting to board a helicopter from a rooftop apartment complex shortly before Saigon fell to advancing North Vietnamese troops. At the time, Vietnam was the longest war in U.S. history. During the war and in the decades of rebuilding the relationship between the U.S. and Vietnam, there were many learned lessons and still others that were ignored. Those lessons are the subject of upcoming events presented by the University of Vermont Leahy Public Policy Forum, the U.S. War in Vietnam, looking back after 50 years. Our guests today are David Jenemann, the Dean of the UVM Patrick Leahy Honors College, and former U.S. Senator Patrick Leahy, who represented Vermont in the U.S. Senate from 1975 to 2023. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yep. And we're absolutely happy to have you. Senator Leahy, you actually served on the Armed Services Committee, and that was one of your first appointments when you started in the Senate. Why did you choose that, even though you were a somewhat vocal opponent to the Vietnam War?
Well, I actually wanted to go on appropriations. There's no spot there. They said, well, go on Armed Services. They knew I was an opponent of the war, even though the majority of Vermonters, ironically at that time, supported it. And they said, there's going to be votes in Vietnam here. And I went to it. We ended up having what turned out to be the critical vote. They had to reauthorize the war in Vietnam. And it had always been done automatically. Nobody had ever voted to end the war. I said I would vote to end it. And I remember hearing from everybody from the President to the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, coming to my office and all, explained no Vermonter had ever voted against it. Might talk about it, but never voted against it. Make a long story short, we had 5 votes. Each one, the war lost by 1 vote. And I was the junior most member of the Senate. Got some dirty looks from the chair, but the war ended. In retrospect, it should have ended decades before. It was a huge, huge mistake. And the thousands and thousands of American lives lost, thousands and thousands of Vietnamese lives in Laos and Cambodia with the landmines and everything in there. It's a tragedy upon tragedy.
And you actually tell a story in your memoir, The Road Taken. It's a story about when President Ford called you when you and your beautiful wife Marcelle were trying to put your kids to bed when they were much younger. And it started as a conversation about Vietnam. Can you tell me how that phone call went and how it managed to go from Vietnam to talking about skiing in Vermont?
Well, I think the President heard that I might be voting against it. He wanted Henry Kissinger to come by my office and talk to me. And he started talking about the vote, and I said, Mr. President, I am opposed to the war. He said, well, no Vermonter has ever voted to end the war. They've spoken about their concerns, but never voted. I said, well, I'm going to vote against it. And then he said, well, how's Vermont? And he started talking about how much he loves skiing in Vermont. And subsequently, years later, as I knew him better, he was showing me and Marcel pictures of the two of them skiing in Stowe. And but I made it very clear I was opposed to it, and I was going to vote no. I said the same thing to Kissinger, Secretary Schlesinger, who came by, and there was a lot of pressure, but I felt best about it. But interestingly enough, a senator who had always voted for the war, Harry Flood Byrd, who was very conservative, actually original segregationist from Virginia, he voted no. And I remember the chair asking him, did you mean to vote no? He said, yes, they've lied to me long enough. And that's really said what happened in the war. There's just been lie upon lie from Tonkin Gulf on through. Taught me never make this mistake again. but it's also one of the reasons why I worked very hard to bring the U.S. and Vietnam back together.
And let's jump a little bit forward to present day, shifting gears to talking about this upcoming forum, and that's entitled The U.S. War in Vietnam, Looking Back After 50 Years. And there are two events encompassing this look back. The first is a keynote address by David Marianis, a Pulitzer Prize winner and the current associate editor of the Washington Post, and that's happening on October 1st. The next day, there was a series of panel discussions about the legacy of the war, and those are both open to the public. David, what do you really want attendees to take away from this?
First of all, we are thrilled that the inaugural Public Policy Forum in honor of Senator Leahy is on this topic. As the Senator said, I mean, this was such a significant moment in the country's history as well as in his career in the Senate. And I think one of the things we'd like folks to come away with is understanding the significance of those events, the significance of the war, and then the subsequent work that the Senator did in Vietnam in normalizing relationships over the intervening 40 to 50 years. I think that's an important part of the story as well. And so with David Marianis, who is going to talk about his book about 1967 in Vietnam and the United States, we really want people to come away with an understanding of how nuanced and complex the responses to the war were. If you read Mr. Marianis's book, no one in the book comes off as a villain. Everyone has complicated motives, everyone has complicated feelings about the war, whether they're U.S. soldiers who are participating in the war, students on the home front, university administrators who are having to deal with student protests, Lyndon Johnson. Everyone has a complex set of motivations guiding their actions, and to make a courageous vote like the Senator did took a lot of synthesizing of a lot of countervailing ideas, tendencies, and emotions, and we want people to understand what that looked like. And then with the panel that follows up, we want people to come away with an understanding of how this impacted Vermont. And so we have sessions with veterans of the war who are from Vermont. We have sessions with people who have Vermont connections, who worked in Vietnam after the war, and we have some special guests who have worked to ban landmines, to work in the Defense Department and the State Department, to really think about how this country interacts with Vietnam in the intervening 50 years.
And as an academic yourself, what do you hope people kind of take away from the last 50 years of kind of coming back from the Vietnam War?
As someone who works in university administration and works with students, I would love people to understand how the events that are embroiling campuses today are not dissimilar to the events that were embroiling campuses in the 1960s. Complexity of the political situation that was confronting the United States in the 1960s, particularly in 1967 when University of Wisconsin was locked down. That was what Marianis decided to feature in his book, is really not unlike what we're seeing on campuses around the country today in response to the war in Israel and Gaza. As somebody who works in higher education, we have to remind our students, but we also have to remind ourselves that this is part of what being at an institution of higher learning is all about. It's about having those difficult conversations and discussions, and sometimes they get vexed and heated, but
that's an understatement.
but at the end of the day, universities are the front lines of where ideas about what's right and wrong in American governance take place.
Yeah, I really didn't want this symposium to be anywhere other than the University of Vermont because of all the people and the views that come in there. I would hope that members of the public would come. It's open to the public. They could just come in and hear these discussions. It is a seminar, I hate to call it that in a way because it's so tragic, of why you don't go to war, because the consequences go on for generations afterward.
And a title like that of this event kind of implies that a lot of those lessons were learned. And at the time of the Vietnam War, it was the longest war in U.S. history, but that's actually since been surpassed by the war in Afghanistan. What do you think that kind of says about learning those lessons?
Well, I'm not sure the lessons were really learned. I mean, Afghanistan and Iraq, wars that nobody thought of what's the ending going to be. And if you can't think about what the ending is going to be, you shouldn't get in there. We're always going to face people who are countries who are opposed to us. But it doesn't mean we go to war. It means we show the strength of our students coming to the United States, our economic strength and manufacturing and all that. There's so many things we can point out where the United States could be a leader. We're not a leader in saying we can go to war and take you over. Of course we're powerful as a country. We're a significant part of NATO, which probably wouldn't exist without us. That's important as a deterrent. But we should always ask, why would we get in a war unless it is for the good of the world, for the good of us? Vietnam was not. Vietnam has to be studied as what a terrible mistake. Now, on the plus side, I look at how it's changed. I remember when the first President Bush, George H.W., was there, I was urging that we go to Vietnam. We did not have full relations with them yet. Use the Leahy War Victims Fund for landmine victims, for getting prosthetics and everything else. And the State Department was opposed to it. I talked to President Bush. He favored it. He made one call and there was suddenly everybody changed their mind. And we went over. I brought a bipartisan group of senators. We went over and we were getting wheelchairs for people who lost their legs from American landmines. And long story short, I'll never forget, on a hot day, a man just staring at me, no legs. And I thought, he must hate me. Twice his size, an American. We blew his legs off. They asked me to pick him up and put him in his wheelchair. I did. As I started to get up, he grabbed my shirt. He pulled me down. He kissed me. You never forget something like that.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And the Leahy Public Policy Forum, the U.S. War in Vietnam, a look back after 50 years, is happening on October 1st and 2nd. You can check the website go.uvm.edu/Leahy Forum for more details. And that takes care of our program for today. My thanks to the crew behind the scenes here at WCAX. I'm Joleil Whitney. Have a good one.